Hello. I'll just wait one moment for a photo. Hello and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name's Daniel Hurst and I'll be hosting today's event. Matthew Friedman is here to speak to us about modern slavery and human trafficking. He's the CEO of the Mekong Club, an organisation of Hong Kong-based private sector business leaders who've joined forces to help fight human trafficking across Asia. He'll be speaking to us today about the big picture issue, how big a problem it is and the nature of the problem today, a bit about why why he's working with businesses to address the problem, and then he'll tell us a bit about the situation in Japan. He's meeting with 17 multinationals and local Japanese companies as part of his appointments in Japan over the last few days. I'll turn the floor over to him, and can I ask everybody to ensure your phones are set to manner mode? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for this opportunity to be here to inform you a little bit about human trafficking and modern slavery. As Daniel indicated, I'll just start with the big picture and then kind of move down to Asia and then talk a little bit about what's happening in Japan as well. To begin with, when most people think about human trafficking, they think about the top left-hand photo there of the forced prostitution. For good reason. There's 4.5 million women and girls in forced prostitution. And it was also prostitution that created the issue of human trafficking. Years ago, about 30 years ago, people like me who were public health officers were doing HIV/AIDS programs. We would go into the brothels, we would talk about condom use, and after that we would say, well, what's your story? How did you get here? Prior to that, nobody paid any attention to women in prostitution, so they never heard these stories. What we heard over and over again is how they were tricked and deceived and forced into prostitution. Many of them had horrific situations, and so the issue of modern slavery started pretty much because of HIV/AIDS. Gradually over time, people started to say, well, wait a minute, it's not just forced prostitution, it includes other things as well. For example, you see the top right-hand picture of fishing. The story behind this is often, let's use as an example, a Cambodian boy told that he can get work on a fishing boat in Thailand. He's told that the boat will go out for only about 3 months, but actually when he gets on the boat and goes out, it stays out for 4 years. He'll work 18, 19 hours a day, every day. In order to get him to work, they will beat him, torture him. He often eats just rice and fish. If he gets sick, if he gets injured, they throw him off the boat. At the end of the 4 years, he doesn't get anything at all. That's an example of human trafficking. The construction example we see across Asia as well. Often the story behind this is a person is told that they can get a job on a construction site, but the foreman says, okay, well, basically we need to pay you after 3 months. 3 months goes by, he asks for his money, the guy says, well, you need another 2 months, another 2 months, another 2 months. It just goes on and on. He knows if he leaves, he'll lose everything, but he's never going to get paid. When it gets to a point where he puts so much pressure on the foreman makes a call to the immigration police, they pick him up, they deport him, they get a year of free labor from this person. The bottom right-hand picture is of a sweatshop called Ranya Pao. We did a raid and rescue of this years ago. And the story behind this is people from Myanmar hear that there's work in this particular location. They go up to the factory, they knock on the door. Factory owner comes out and says, well, what do you want? I'm looking for a job. Factory owner says, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of $50 US, but you have to stay in the factory. This guy's never made more than $25. He's thrilled. He takes the job, goes into the factory, works under horrific conditions, but at least he knows he can send money home. After about 2 months, he goes up to the factory owner and says, I'd like to be paid. Factory owner says, well, you know, I forgot to mention one thing. It costs $54 for you to be here. I'm only paying you $50. In fact, you owe me money. So before we did this raid and rescue, all of these people were being kept in this situation where every single day they got deeper and deeper into debt. Once a month, they would take one of these people to the back, beat them until they were bloody, take photographs of it, and then basically say, if you try to leave, this will happen to not only you, but your family. These are all examples of modern slavery. Now, the interesting thing about the terminology human trafficking is that it's being replaced with new terminology, modern slavery. The reason for this is that in the early days, when human trafficking was identified, it was about the movement of a person from one country to another. The movement internationally was considered important. So that's why they called it trafficking, because trafficking equates movement of something, whether it's drugs or arms, in this particular case, human beings. Gradually, over time, people started to say, well, wait a minute. It doesn't matter if a person goes from one country to another, or from one province to another, or from one side of the street to the other side. It makes no difference. It's the end point of that, the exploitation, that's a problem. So if a person doesn't get paid, if they can't leave the situation, if there's fraudulent debt, if there's violence or threats, if their documents are being taken, the closest word in English is slavery. But because slavery is often equated with something that happened in the past, they put the word modern next to it. So what you will see is more of an emphasis on modern slavery as opposed to human trafficking, once again, because it focuses on the exploitation itself. The numbers related to human trafficking are estimated to be 45.8 million. If you look at Asia, about 66% or 30 million are in Asia, basically for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot of people in this part of the world. You have China, 1.3 billion, India, 1.25 billion, you have Japan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, all have huge populations. You add them up, you get a disproportionate number of people in this part of the world. Second, the feudal systems that have existed in this part of the world are still in place. Some of them go back hundreds of years. So you go to Beijing and you look at a very modern city, but go in 20 kilometers in any direction, you can still find highly exploitative activities taking place in the rural area. When it comes to Japan, according to the Slavery Index, you can go online and find this publication, 80,000 victims, and they basically divide it into two categories. Forced prostitution, so these are women and girls who basically are in prostitution and they can't get out, or the technical intern training program. There's approximately 1 million people in that program. There's a lot of people who are very satisfied with that program. They're being mentored, but there's also a certain percentage that are identified as being in this situation. This is an estimate. The estimate is made from a whole variety of proxies that come together. You can take it or leave it. That's what they have come up with. I'm the messenger in this particular case. When it comes to the mega sporting events that are coming up, the rugby 2019 and the 2020 Olympic Games, obviously Japan's interested in ensuring that that comes across in a very positive, supportive way. The Olympics are supposed to be very happy and festive, but it doesn't always happen that way. In the UK, there were some concerns about how the construction was done, and there were also uniforms and other things that got tainted with the possibility of forced labor. And I think that the Japanese government is very sensitive about wanting that not to happen in this particular case. The rate of exploitation, about 9.2 million people per year. In a day, 25,200, or in an hour, 1,000, or one new slave every 4 seconds. When it comes to the adults versus children, about a quarter of the cases are children, the rest are adults. Most people think that human trafficking is about forced prostitution. It only represents about a quarter of the cases. The rest of the cases are forced labor cases. And as it relates to us as consumers, 60% of the forced labor cases are associated with supply chains. So we buy food and clothing and electronics. Somewhere in those supply chains is often the possibility of slavery. So we have all supported human slavery. And if you're interested, there's a very interesting website, Slavery Footprint. If you go onto that website and fill out their questionnaire, it will identify the number of slaves that basically you support. And so it's a very interesting way of applying, kind of like carbon in global warming, your carbon footprint. It helps it make it relevant to us as human beings. When it comes to who's supposed to address the issue, well, governments are supposed to do this. But this particular issue is very confusing. A lot of governments don't like it. The idea of having slaves basically in in the country, kind of creates a sense of deterrence to getting involved. So they do things, but not nearly as much as they should. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I believe in the United Nations system, but frankly speaking, I spent a lot of time in five-star hotels eating great food, talking about poverty. There was a real disconnect between what we were doing and what we should have been doing. Non-government organizations, basically for the most part, do the lion's share of the work. But if we go back to the statistics again, if 75% of what we're dealing with is forced labor and 60% of that are associated with supply chains, you need the corporate sector to be involved. But if governments don't like this topic, the corporations really hate it. Partly because they're often on the receiving end of somebody pointing a finger at them and saying it's because of you that we have this situation. Now, there are a lot of brands that are very responsible, and they're mortified if in their supply chain they find this, but a lot of consumers feel like corporations will use slavery in order to have dividends. It's not true in most cases, but that's the assumption that exists. So I've talked a little bit about how many people are in slavery and who's supposed to address it. Now I'm going to show you the report card for last year. How many people were helped globally with the UN and the NGOs and the governments all combined, and how many criminals went to jail out of about 500,000. And here are the numbers. Last year, we helped about 66,000 people out of 45.8 million. That's 0.2%, not even 1%. When it comes to the criminals, put about 7,000 of them in jail out of 500,000. You can see that we basically are not even in the race here. And that's part of the reason why the incentive to bring the corporate sector in, because they've come to realize that the NGO sector by themselves are never going to be able to make a significant dent unless we open up a new front. The reason for the fact that the NGOs aren't or the public sector isn't able to make much of a difference is the profits generated from modern slavery are estimated to be $150 billion a year. The amount of money that goes into addressing it is about $350 million, or 0.23%. So the problem is huge. It's this big, and the resources are very tiny. To put this into perspective, in the United States, we eat $6 billion worth of potato chips. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money globally that's used to fight modern slavery. You can see what we are up against. When it comes to other reasons, there's about 15,000 NGO-type people like me that work around the world to address this issue against 500,000 greed-incentivized criminals who have, as much money as they can earn, they earn. The other thing is, because of the clandestine nature of this particular issue, it's hidden and it's hard to find. And so unless you know where to find it or how to find it, you don't. And so somebody like me, I've been doing this for years. I could probably in 3 or 4 hours, if I went in 5 kilometers in any direction here, find something. But if you don't get trained on that, you won't be able to do it. So the relevance to the business world is, okay, if there's $150 billion generated from modern slavery, if any of that gets into a legitimate bank, it's basically money laundering. And who gets fined? The bank does. So the banks are very concerned about this, because if they can't figure out where the potential nexus between their business and the criminal activity, and somebody finds out about that, they can get fined. There's a couple of examples of banks being significantly fined for this type of thing. When it comes to kind of the manufacturing world, the issue is that most manufacturers have at least three tiers. The first tier is where they assemble things. The second tier is where the component parts come from. Let's say it's a running shoe. So tier 1 is where they assemble it. Tier 2 is where you get the shoelaces and the rivets and the sole. And tier 3 is the raw material. Up until recently, companies have regularly audited tier 1, but have never been asked to go down to tier 2 or 3. But the legislation I'll talk about in a few minutes has as an expectation that they have to go all the way down to that. So imagine if you're a major company that has 1,200 factories, and each of those factories has 5 additional tier 2 below the tier 1, and then below that another 10. You're talking about literally thousands of additional units of audits. So the manufacturing world struggles with What do we do in order to have full transparency? When it comes to retailers, retailers buy things. And so the Costco's and the Tesco's and the Walmarts want to buy products to give you a good price, but when they do that, sometimes they get accused of basically supporting slavery. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Why would the hotels care about this? Actually, the hotels have 4 reasons. The hotels get built, construction. You have third-party contracts for the cleaners. You have the supply chain for shellfish and so forth that could be tainted, and you have forced prostitution. So all of these businesses have a concern because if they don't do something, something may happen. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about some of the business trends. People feel like, well, the only way you're going to get businesses to do things is if you push them into it. So oftentimes legislation and reporting tends to be around, you did something bad and we're going to let people know so that you can make this a better thing. When it comes to the modern slavery issue, there's 4 trends that we're seeing related to that particular approach. One is legislation. California Transparency Supply Chain Act came into play in 2012. It basically says that if you're a company that has one product in California and you make $100 million in either retail or manufacturing, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address the issue of modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. The UK Modern Slavery Act came out and said, well, we're going to reduce the ceiling from 100 million to 36 million pounds, but we're going to add 2 more things to it. You have to have an annual report, and that annual report has to be signed by the board of directors. So because that ceiling is relatively low, most companies in the world are responsible for reporting to this. New legislation is coming forward, and some of it will eventually have fines and penalties. So what we see is with each batch of regulations, it gets a little bit more severe for the corporations. The second thing is we're seeing lawsuits, mostly in the United States, against companies. Costco's, Mars, Nestle's, Hershey's, they're all in lawsuits. Basically, the people bringing the suits are saying, well, you're working in areas where there's modern slavery, the cocoa industry or in the fishing industry, and we feel like you should have something on the side of your packaging that says tainted by slavery. Imagine if you picked up a can of tuna fish and on the side of it it said this can is tainted by slavery. Not a good day for that particular company. Who's going to want to buy that? We're seeing much more news coverage of this. And you, as journalists, are probably seeing this as well. The coverage for the last 4 years has almost doubled every year. And this year it's exploded. You see the CNN Liberia story, or Libya, I don't remember which country it was. You see the Guardian is doing it. Many major papers and news and television are having more and more exposés. And so what we're seeing is that actually the environmental movement coverage is going down, and it seems like modern slavery is the new issue of our time. Lastly, we have campaigners, organizations that use basically campaigns to go after corporations. Many of them are very well resourced. One of them has a list of around 10 million people. And if they think a particular company is not doing something right, they send an email to 10 million people saying, send an email to that company. You can imagine if you're a compliance officer in a company that's being hit with one of these email blasts, on a Monday morning, if you were to get 10 million emails, not a good day for them. So a lot of the emphasis is on naming and shaming, boycotting. Just to talk a little bit about boycotting, the reason why I don't support it, in Thailand there's something like 360,000 fishermen. They think somewhere around 18% of them are tainted with slavery circumstances. If you boycott shellfish from Thailand, well, maybe you have an effect on the 18%, maybe you don't, but you're hurting a lot of other people as well. So that's part of the reason why boycotts, it seems very simple and straightforward, but not necessarily the best thing to do. So what this approach does is it creates kind of a chilling effect for the private sector. They don't want to have anything to do with this topic. They pull back. Companies do what they can to protect their business, but they stay out of sight. And all of the resources and the prestige and the problem-solving skills and experience that the corporations have isn't able to be used to help address the issue. And so they just pull back. An alternative approach we're seeing is to perhaps engage the private sector in a positive way. If you stop and look at the Fortune 500 companies' revenues last year, something like $34 trillion. Okay, even if 0.0001% of that was applied to helping to make this a better world, and in this particular case, helping with modern slavery, imagine how much good could be done with that. So you have to balance the question. Does going after companies that prevents them from getting involved help more than working with them and engaging them and getting in part of them? It's a debate that's going on now. So what we're seeing is companies training their entire staff. A lot of op-eds are being done by organizations like me. You know, and it was interesting. I did an op-ed in South China Morning Post, and I had a bunch of hate mail afterwards from some NGOs. These are all friends of mine. I worked with them, and they were like, okay, well, Matt, you know, are you taking kickbacks now from the private sector? I mean, what happened to you to get you to cross over? You used to be a name and shamer. Why are you working with them now? And my answer to that was, well, I have access. I can go into a company, sit down, talk to them, help them, be a part of the process. Before, when I did that, I wasn't able to do it. So for me, I consider it to be important. And don't get me wrong, I understand there's a place for both naming and shaming, but you also have to have a carrot as well. And if you don't have that, you don't have balance between the two. Our organization just happens to work on the positive side. Corporations have tremendous potential for innovation. You know, they can develop apps, they can develop technology things. I'll show you an example of that. And when you get a bunch of organizations together, they can use their leadership. It can help to reduce modern slavery. And so in my case, because it's really difficult to know which companies aren't doing the right thing, because we don't have an even way of getting that information, so that's why I don't agree with boycotts. To me, I like boycotts. A boycott says, here's a company that's doing everything they can to basically try to address the issue. And that's a positive thing. We should encourage people to go in that particular direction. So this alternative approach, in Hong Kong, they're trying to recast the way the private sector addresses the problem. Instead of naming and shaming, we're emphasizing a positive, proactive, heroic role for the corporate world. And they are tapping into the resources, the prestige, the problem solving, and the experience that they have. And I'll give you some concrete examples. So I'll talk about a tale of two cities, and I'll start with Hong Kong because that's where basically we work. And part of the reason why the organization that I work with was set up in Hong Kong was because we were told that Hong Kong was mission impossible. And what we were told over and over again was this: Hong Kong only cares about money. Hong Kong will use slaves to make profits. Hong Kong doesn't care about human rights. Hong Kong will not help anyone. We heard it over and over again. Actually, we hear similar things about Tokyo, but let's start with Hong Kong. Not true, okay? And so let's talk a little bit about what my organization does. The organization is called the Mekong Club. What an unusual name for an organization that works with the corporate world to address modern slavery. Well, the reason why it had that name is that the people that came up with the organization, they wanted a name that didn't say human rights this or anti that. They didn't want the name to scare corporations away. So they said, let's have a neutral name, the Mekong Club. The Mekong River goes through Southeast Asia. It links up a bunch of countries, so they decided to call it that. The way the Mekong Club works, it's an association. And there are members that come together within finance, footwear and apparel, hospitality and retail. And what these companies do is they come together 4 times a year to talk about what they think needs to happen in their respective sector. And because the private sector, unlike the NGO world, doesn't have time for endless meetings, you either come up with a solution and work with it, or it's not going to move forward. And so there's a lot of pressure to basically deliver on the suggestions that are made following these things. So the idea is you create awareness by doing presentations similar to this, but to corporations. Get people to come together as a community, get them to think about what they need in the way of innovation and tools, and then you develop outreach with the hope of an expectation that that will reduce modern slavery. You also try to identify within the corporate sector who are those people who inherently, for whatever reason, really do care about this issue. And they will go out out on their own time. They will go and talk about this issue to other companies, get other people involved. And because data is an essential part of organizations understanding what they need to do, and the corporate world values that, a lot of emphasis is on data collection analysis as well. So just to give you a sense of what some of the tools were developed, and these are tools from corporations. The first one is they said that we needed an e-learning toolkit. Now, if you look at most e-learning toolkits, they usually 45 minutes to an hour. But the problem with them is nobody watches anything more than 3 minutes now. So we decided to basically come up with 3-minute videos, 15 of them, so it adds up to 45 minutes. But if you want to look at definitions, you can look at that, legislation, what are the statistics, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically it's bite-sized pieces. But because 90% of what we're dealing with here is in English, we're putting them in 12 languages. So at present, we have it in English, Mandarin, Cantonese, Burmese, Vietnamese, French. Why those random ones first is because we get volunteers to help us to do this. The business world helps us with that. So these videos then are available to be put out there to factories, to workers, so that when we go to China and talk to people, they can say, oh yeah, I heard about it because I saw something that happened to be for the first time in my own language. Another thing is the banking world said, okay, well, we need some type of a dashboard to identify relative risk for products that we may be supporting in relative countries. And so what we did is took a bunch of indices from existing data, created an algorithm for country risk, and then basically what we did is identified from data sets all over the world, you know, what's the risk in countries for cotton, for bamboo, for beef, and so forth. And so, as you see with the shrimp example, shrimp in both Myanmar and Thailand is considered risky. We have a relative score, and then we would list all of the various citations and so forth related to that. We do this because banks need some type of empirical foundation for the business risks that they are looking to identify. The bankers also are concerned that if they can't identify red flags of potential issues, that they won't be able to, within their systems, identify where criminal activity may happen. And so they develop what are called typologies. A typology is basically looking at the movement of basically the perpetrator and the victim, and on the bottom one, it looks at the relationship with money. Now, to give you an example of a red flag, in the United States, in the United States, there was a nail salon franchise, and it had hours from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. Some regulators noticed that there were transactions taking place at 2 or 3 in the morning, all around $200 US. When they looked into it, they came to realize there was a sex trafficking ring in the same location. The red flag are expenditures after hours. That wouldn't work in Hong Kong, because if you want to get your nails done at 2 o'clock in the morning, you've got a Kowloon, and there's a lot of places that will do it. So it's not a red flag, so you have to identify specific red flags per locations. So a red flag here would be a travel company that buys contraceptives, or a modeling company that has regular visits for health checkups with a OBGYN doctor, something like that. So the banks look for this, then they can put it into their search engine so that they can identify expenditures related to that, so they can look into it to see whether or not there may be some nefarious activity taking place there. They ask us to basically develop a search engine that would allow for all the good articles that you guys write to be in one place related to this. And so if you search India, garments, and forced labor on Google, you're going to get a lot of garbage, okay? Because to get the articles you need, they're buried, and some of them aren't. So we collect 200 or 300 articles a month, and we put it into the search engine. So anything you want to know about forced labor, modern slavery, et cetera, is in one place. Some companies were very interested in what they are going to do if they find forced labor. Because usually what happens is on the back of of a report that a company like Verite puts out. There's like a page and a half that says, if you find this, this is what you're supposed to do. But it's much more complicated because each case has a whole variety of different segments and components. And so we developed with the corporate world a toolkit that allows you for communications to identify kind of a flow chart of all the steps that you have to take. Who needs to be contacted? When do you contact them? What are the legal obligations? How do you address the needs of the victims? And so you can't see it with this particular format, but these are the categories, and there's probably 200 or 300 boxes that allow you to quickly get at the information you need to address the issue. Organizations, Adidas, for example, feels like they're doing really good work. But if they try to tell the world, it's Adidas trying to tell the world that what they're doing. So we vet as a third party whether or not we think what they're doing is consistent with what they say, and then we put something out. So as a third party, we're vetting whether or not this particular organization is doing what it needs to be doing. Google came to us and said, okay, well, can you use technology in the private sector to address this issue? So we said, okay, well, we'll try. So we went down to Thailand and we talked to the authorities there, and we said to them, what's the biggest issue you face? And they said, well, we come in contact with potential migrants that are being exploited, but we don't know where they come from and how to communicate with them. So we developed this very simple app, and the way it works is you simply have a smartphone with these maps on it, or flags. You get them to press the flag from where they come from, and then a video in their language comes on and says, let's say if they hit Burmese one, we're the authorities. We don't know if there's an issue or not, but we're going to ask you some questions. If the answer to the question is yes, press green. No, press red. Are you here against your will? Yes or no, green or red. Do you need help? Yes or no. Are you being exploited? Yes or no. If they hit green once, you know there's an issue. By having this app, when it was pilot tested, it increased victim identification by 30%. Okay, so if we're dealing with 0.2% of the victims, we can find tools to increase victim identification. That's the direction we should be going in. A similar app which is being developed, again because the corporate world in Hong Kong thinks it's important, is a tablet version of that. So if there's an audit taking place, and the auditor doesn't want to have the manager behind him as he's interviewing the workers, what they do is they'll get 25 workers to randomly be selected, and one at a time they go in here, they press the flag from where they come from, a video comes on, you can actually see somebody, it says we're going to ask you some questions, this is all randomized in a way nobody knows who said what. You'll be asked 13 questions, yes, no, and you can put some health and safety and exploitation questions in there, et cetera, to get at the information you want. You take the tablet back, you get the victim's voice. A creative way of basically finding the information you need. In Hong Kong, the organizations we work with said, you know, we're doing a lot of good stuff and everyone thinks that we aren't, so let's do a pledge. So they came up with a pledge. This is the terminology for it. It's very simple. But then they said, well, pledges are very hollow unless you have something to back it up. So they said to our organization, can you get a list of 10 categories of things that we all potentially could be doing? In order to get on the pledge, you have to be doing 5 of them. If you sign the pledge and you're doing 2, you have a year to get the 5, but you have to eventually get 5. So the idea is that we eventually then have that translate into a business index risk, because the corporations want some type of a metric, kind of like the Dow Jones average. Nobody knows how that's calculated, but we use it as an indicator of change over time. These are some of our members. There's others. I just couldn't fit them on here, just to give you a relative sense of the types of corporations that we're working with. You know, the lessons learned with the private sector for me is, okay, number 1, I'm an American. Number 2, I worked for the UN. Number 3, I worked for the US government for 17 years. Going into a corporation in Asia with those credentials doesn't open doors for me, okay, because they perceive me as part of the potential enemy. So it took a long time to develop trust, but trust comes from talking to them, encouraging them, and doing a lot of presentations over and over again, because confidentiality is essential. That takes a lot of patience. I learned that. The private sector demands quality. You just can't come up with stuff and then put it out there the way I used to when I was with the UN. You just throw something together and hand. It has to meet a particular. So we end up spending more money, but we get better products as a result of that. You can't waste the private sector's time. When I first was starting to work with the private sector, you know, as a good public sector person, I went into one meeting with my 168 slides, and after the fourth slide, they said, "Are you almost done?" There's a big distinction between the way the NGO world works and the last thing is, or the last two things is, the private sector wants to be a part of the process, but they are seldom put in a situation where they can come together as a group and work as a group. Now, the reason why shoe companies will come together on this particular issue is that if one shoe company gets into trouble, the assumption is that everybody else will too. And so, you know, they say, we are not going to compete on this. We're going to work together and we'll compete on everything else. And so the banks have basically the same thing. They want to be able to come together. And as a result of that, you know, we hope that these tools will result in some type of impact. And so what we're really trying to do is to open up a completely new front. Why? Because we're helping only 0.2% of the victims in the world today. And if we continue just using NGOs, that's going to continue. So even if you double or triple or quadruple us, we're still at less than 1%. We need to open up another front. But we don't want to open up another front that results in the NGOs and the corporations being at odds with each other. It's counterproductive. It takes away from a collective response. So let's talk about Tokyo. Before I came here and various other times, this is what I heard about Tokyo. Tokyo people only care about money. Tokyo people will not get involved. Tokyo people deny there is any exploitation. Tokyo will not help anyone. I haven't found this to be the case. I have been here. I did 17 presentations with a bunch of different companies already. My apologies for not being able to name those companies because I didn't get their permission beforehand. And I wish I had, because I would have listed. I know that many of them wouldn't have cared that I had that conversation, but I can't give you that information because I have this relationship that I have to maintain with them. What we really need to do here, though, in Japan is to create awareness. I found that the awareness of this particular issue was very, very low, similar to where we were 3 years ago in Hong Kong. Bringing the companies together, I think, is possible. We'll come back again in April and do some banking training. We came here. I didn't know if I would get anyone to talk to me. And it's a very similar presentation to this. We're not selling anything. We're just kind of helping people to understand what's out there and what they need to do and so forth. But after I made a series of presentations to some of the banks and to the manufacturers, they're like, okay, well, now that we know what you're talking about, recognizing that we need to have, you know, somebody in our company know about this, can you come back and do a bunch of training for us? And so, you know, and then I asked, do you mind if multiple companies do that? And they said, no, no problem. You review existing policies. So many of them haven't even looked at their policies to see if they're in compliance. And so, you know, when a legal person in an organization doesn't know if the policies are in compliance, obviously they haven't spent much time talking about it. And so I think that they want to be in compliance, and I think you'll see a lot of them moving in that direction. I think that companies need to identify their own set of tools, what works in Tokyo, and have the corporate world develop their own things. Create the tools. We can help, or we can help them to figure out how they can do it themselves. It doesn't matter. But the tools allow for them to be able to, similar to the tools that we talked about, to be able to identify business risk and address it. Get more companies involved and use this as a means of creating a force of good. With the Olympics coming up and the Rugby 2019, there is always the concern that if bad press comes out because of a construction site or a uniform or something, and so I've met with the government since I've been here. They're concerned about that. They want to ensure that that doesn't occur. So I think there will be a certain amount of additional scrutiny on this particular topic, more so than you've seen, because this issue is very much needed. In my last slide, I'm just going to tell you a story to kind of close out my feeling on this particular issue. And I've been looking and working on this for 30 years, and so I'm a person who has been exposed to a lot of things. 27 years ago when I was in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to help address the issue of modern slavery. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of this book project, I would go from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Gita, and every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she sat and listened to all the other interviews. As I was about to leave, Gita comes running up and says, okay, well, you can have my interview. She sat on one side of the table, the rest of us sat on the other side of the table, and over a 3-hour period, she told literally the worst story I'd ever heard. Rape and torture and betrayal and murder and disease, everything I had heard times 10. Honestly didn't know what to say. Finally, I turned to Gita and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at those traffickers for the horrible things they did to you. She paused and then said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She kept saying, where were you? So that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said she went to school till she was 12 years old. She knew everything around her was illegal, right out in the open. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. Said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at society for not caring enough. And I tell that because we have 45.8 million people in slavery. And the collective work of the organizations that I work with is helping 0.2% of them. We are not going to be able to address this issue unless we get the governments, the corporations, the schools, the faith-based groups, the general public. We need an abolitionist movement. We've had them before. They've worked. They've changed things. This is much bigger than the NGOs can handle. This is bigger than, because of the horrificness of this is something we all have to take some responsibility for. So with that, that's part of the reason why we work with the corporate world. Our sense is that if we do that and we engage these companies and get them to cross over the line into not only looking at business risk, but also taking it to the next step. And I can give you examples. Cathay Pacific worked with us, said they wanted to do something, decided to put films on their airplane. A lot of people said that was a good thing. British Telecom decided they wanted to do something. They did a contest among their 10,000 staff to identify IT solutions. Then they had an American Idol type event, gave first, second, and third prize. You know, and so when companies get incentivized, the company gets excited, the employees get excited, everybody's excited. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for your presentation. We'll now open it up to questions. It's a fairly small group, so we'll keep it relatively informal. Are there any questions from working press? Please.
Is it on? Okay, Elaine Kurtenbach, Associated Press. First of all, apologies for being a bit late. I'd love it if you could put the back up the slide that shows the company names from Hong Kong. Just, it would be helpful. It went so quickly, I could only catch Watson. So, thank you. So, it's hard to know where to start, but what level of buy-in are you getting across the region? Is this specifically more based in Hong Kong? Say Korea, for example, where we've been trying to deal with some corporate governance issues, we find there's a great level of deliberate blindness and obfuscation over issues related to workers' rights. I don't know about the slavery issue. And the second question I have is, how much of this is offshore and how much of it is onshore, say, for Japan? Because so much of Japanese manufacturing is everywhere else, and increasingly that's going to be the case. But are we also talking about onshore type of human trafficking and slavery in this particular case?
Yeah, start with the second one. The 80,000 figure that was listed for people that are in modern slavery that comes from the 2016 Slavery Index is onshore. This is talking about both either forced prostitution or the internship program, or just other labor type of situations that take place for which people that are kind of caught in between countries that are here might get into because they are kind of hiding their existence here and so forth. When it comes to the acceptance of the issue, it varies from country to country. We initially went to Hong Kong because we were told that it was the place that would be hardest to make any kind of change. And so we figured we'd go to the hardest place to see whether we could figure out whether it could be done and then use that to learn as many lessons as we could. I recently came back from Bangladesh, did a similar trip. There was tremendous interest in Bangladesh. I mean, the corporate sector was just, they said, okay, when are you coming back? The TV people were involved in helping to educate. They were going to do some translation of our films. We had a lot of associations say they wanted to get involved. It was a completely different reaction from what I hear is happening in Korea. Now, okay, so as a proxy or an indicator, I do a lot of presentations, and at the end of them, you usually get people who come up afterwards to get the card and to ask questions and say, how can I help? What was interesting is that 6 years ago, I did a road trip across Japan. I was 8 days, and I did something like 12 events, and I didn't get a single Japanese person come up to me afterwards. But this time, I don't even get the foreign people coming up. I get Japanese men and women, and mostly men. And a lot of them basically come up and say, well, you know, I had no idea this was happening, and I was really surprised by this. And it really kind of, you know, when I do corporations, I spend a lot more time talking about cases. I'll talk about sex trafficking cases. I didn't do it here because I think you guys know about this and so forth. But you start with the cases because it's an emotional thing. And then, you know, they start to feel like, oh my gosh, well, this is a terrible thing. Real human beings are involved. And so these people come up and basically say, oh my gosh, you know, I wish there was something that I can do. Can I volunteer? Can I be a part of the process? You said that corporate people can get involved. And so, you know, I mean, I was told that wouldn't happen, and it did. In a lot of presentations, I was told that questions won't be asked. And I got a lot of questions. In fact, there were more questions than I had time sometimes, and I had to, you know, 5 hands up, and I had to leave. I had another gig to do that. And so I do feel like there's a change in this particular issue that didn't exist 5 years ago when I was here. I'm not sure what the change is, but it's significant.
Next question.
So can we just clarify the 80,000 number, if you know it's the same breakdown of the 25, 75?
It's not broken down that way. All it is a lump sum. I urge you to look at that report, 2016 one. It's a great data set. It does it for the entire world, and it identifies. Some of the numbers I question. I don't know enough about Japan to know if I feel that number is high or low, but okay, so for example, in Hong Kong, they estimate there's 100,000 women in prostitution. No place I've ever been has had any less than at least 20% in forced prostitution. You know, in some countries it's 95%, but the minimal is 20. So if you knew what the number of people in prostitution was in Japan, and that number is probably available, and you put 20%, that's if somebody would ask me a guesstimate, that's what I would say as a minimum. And even back 6 years ago, I was hearing about the internship program having some potential issues.
And that was, sorry, the figures, slavery index from 2016, is that what you're
That's
referring
correct,
to?
yeah.
Okay.
Walk free.
All right, next question. Can we ask you use your name and affiliation at the beginning of your question, please? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Erol Ahmet. I have a research company. I've got 2 questions. First one is regarding the Japanese overworking. This is not exactly forced labor. A lot of company pressure, peer pressure, resulting in some highly publicized work deaths, with some of them with very big companies. So first, how do you see this issue as part of your realm or something else? The second one is mostly regarding the foreign nationals who are coming to Japan, mostly with a technical training program or with no program at all. They get paid. I'm sure they are actually happy, but in fact, at the end of the day, some of them either get deported, some of them working at very difficult conditions compared to, you know, similar with the Japanese, if they are Japanese, if they were Japanese, and how to treat them, how to see them inside Japan as a problem or as a non-problem. Thank you.
You know, I mean, you can't help but hear the word slavery and then have a reaction. The interesting thing about human trafficking is, as terminology, it really didn't have an emotional response. But when you use slavery, you feel an emotional response. And, you know, just like love gives you an emotional response, words have that effect. War or abortion, whatever it is that you're, so when the moment we went to slavery, then people are like, whoa, wait a minute, that seems pretty extreme for what we're dealing with. And so people often ask the question, what is the simple elevator pitch definition of what you would describe as modern slavery? And for me, it comes down to two things. You don't get paid, and you can't leave the situation, okay? So there's a lot of people who overwork and, you know, work extra hours and don't get paid, but if they can walk out that door, maybe they'd say that they can't, but if they really can, then they belong to somebody else. Okay, and what you're describing, I see it all over Asia, in the big cities. It's a horrific situation. The work-life balance is zero. And as a result of that, these people really have no personal lives at all. You know, it's one of those things that I think some cultures get around to fixing, others don't. But it's a very dangerous scenario for your health, because you're always kind of in front of computers and you're always working and a lot of stress and so forth. And a lot of people in this country, I'm sure, you know, have premature heart attacks and other things, as they do in other parts of Asia because of that. So it's a public health issue as well. So it's an issue. It belongs to somebody, but it doesn't necessarily belong to us. As for those workers that come in, same thing. If they come in and they're working under the radar and they're being exploited, but they have a choice of whether they're in that position or not, then if they choose to remain there and be exploited, they belong to somebody else, not to us. Okay, we are looking for people who want out of a situation and can't get out because of debts or threats or whatever. So that's kind of the way we look at things.
Can I ask, across your work, how often do you find that employers who sponsor a visa have that control over the workers, that's an issue? How often is that threat of sending the person home being used as a stick?
Yeah, you know, okay, so look at this as a continuum from I love my job to I really want to get out of here, it's the most horrible thing. When they use that, there are people in the gray area where they kind of realize that they need the job, or they're not willing to give it up, and so they can be influenced by that. But it's only when if they had a choice of basically, like, I'm going to leave, forget it, I'm not going to take this, and they cross over, and they can do that, okay, they can let them do that. You know, many of us, you could argue that we're trapped in our own lives because I can't think of another job, or I've been here for 17 years and I need that extra 3 years, or, you know, there's a lot of reasons why we feel like we have no choices. But at the end of the day, we do. I don't know of anyone in this room who couldn't just walk away from their job if they wanted to. You can argue that you can't, but you can, okay? It's people who can't that we're really talking about, and those are the ones that we're really trying to figure out how to be able to address. Now, when it comes to the documentation and so forth, people don't understand why that is such an important thing for a person from, say, Cambodia. Maybe it took them 6 years to get that passport or that set of documents, and if they lose it, they'll never get another one. And they desperately want to hold on to that. And so you want leverage to hold a person in place. That's one form of leverage that you can use, you know. And that's why that particular indicator seems is more powerful than people would give it credit for.
Thank you. Next question.
Just to follow up
Sure.
on the previous slide. So debt bondage is included in,
No.
you would say debt bondage is included in the definition of slavery then? Because, I mean, so much of, that is the common practice for so many sort of migrant type jobs.
Yeah, in fact, I would go as far as to say that if you wanted a silver bullet thing to go after, it's migrant labor recruitment, because none of us in this room probably paid for our jobs either. But if you're a Nepalese person and you're making $30 US a month in Nepal and you want to make 150 in another country, you have to pay for that job. And if you don't understand the terms and conditions and somebody wants to exploit you, then you'll end up accepting a contract, working for 5 years and not getting anything at all and actually getting deeper in debt. That's where the exploitation takes place. That's debt bondage, and that is included in this. Yeah, for sure.
Feel free, if we have more questions, repeat questions are fine. I might ask another one. Okay. You mentioned about our own, or consumers' own complicity, I'm not sure if you used that word, but responsibility when it comes to buying products. And you're not keen on boycotts necessarily because of the sort of collateral damage, but the sort of, how do you deal with businesses wrestling with the price issue, right? So the companies are competing on price and they're buying cheap products from other countries. How do you get companies to understand the reputational risk or the humanity outweighs the sort of the market benefit of having the cheaper products?
Well, okay.
It sounds callous, but I'm just...
Well, actually, what happens oftentimes is, and I'll answer this and I'll go back to your more direct question. I have a lot of people that come and say, as a consumer, what can I do? What's your advice? And let's say that you're going to go to a name brand shop and you know you're going to probably buy something. Go online to see whether or not that company has a policy or not. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, say, listen, I like your products. I'm still probably going to buy them, but I'd feel better if you had it. Now, companies, when they get that type of response, a thoughtful response, will give a thoughtful response back to the person. It'll make sure it goes to the communications people. And you sometimes get changes that take place. I'll give you one other example. So I did a presentation in the United States, and I had like 6 or 7 students come up to me afterwards, and they said they want to do something to help a department store in their community to make sure that they knew that the products that they were coming from didn't get tainted by slavery. So what we talked about was every day at around 1 o'clock, they would go to the manager one at a time and say to the manager in a very polite, respectful way, how do you know that all of these products are not tainted by slavery? So the first time they did it, the manager said, well, I don't know. Second day, manager said, I don't know. Third day, manager said, I don't know. Fourth day, he had a piece of paper in his hand. Okay? Fifth day, the paper was on the side. Sixth, it was at the cashiers. Seventh, basically, I could go to a cashier and they would do it. He just made a decision to proactively do what was needed because he recognized that this was a question that might keep coming at 1 o'clock every day. And so it's a very simple way of kind of engaging with them. When it comes to, you know, the whole boycott thing for me, if everyone could be judged, all the companies could be judged exactly the same, if there was a methodology, so you knew the ones that were really good and ones that weren't good and some that, then you could really use kind of some type of a yardstick to say, okay, don't go after them. But the thing about naming and shaming is it's usually the biggest of biggest companies. You know, they go after the big ones because they get the biggest splash. You're not going to find a little retailer. You're going to find Walmart and Tesco and Costco. Those are the ones they're going to go after because you get the biggest bang for the buck. Doesn't mean that everyone else doesn't have the same issues. You know, so when it comes to consumers getting information, the California Transparency and UK Modern Slavery almost mandate that every major company brand has to have something on their website now. So that information is available. If they don't, then it's kind of an issue that first of all, they're breaking the law. And second of all, you know, they're opening themselves up to scrutiny because some people might say, don't buy from that company because obviously they don't care enough to do that.
Any other follow-up questions before we wrap up? Yes.
About China. I see a lot of Western name companies up there. Are you working to get buy-in from Chinese corporations, which are increasingly such an important part of the Asian economy?
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping to hire a Chinese person to basically do the presentations. You know, to have, once again, an American, Caucasian, State Department person go in and talk in English and have it be translated. There's a lot lost in translation. And the way you present it to a Chinese person is different from a Western audience. Western audience, I can start off by saying we're talking about modern slavery, and you shake your head with acceptance of the fact that that topic exists. In China, not the same thing. You shut them down even with the title. So the way you have to do it is say, have you seen this type of exploitative situation? Oh, you have? Okay, what about this one? What about this? That's what we're calling modern slavery now. So you just have to change the order, and to have it be delivered by a Chinese person is much better. Are they interested in the topic? Yes, because a certain number of Chinese companies, especially the bigger ones, want to eventually go multinational, and they recognize that for that to happen, they have to have more of these human rights standards and so forth built into it.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today. Matthew Friedman, thank you very much for your very interesting, thought-provoking and, in some cases, shocking presentation.
Thank you.
And we wish you all the best for your efforts, and you'll be returning to Japan, I understand.
Thank you very much for
your time today.
Yes, thank you.